Well, in effect, when a government is unable to meet its costs, its processes, if not its actual formal indebtedness, are in default. And of course, if it's accumulating further debt, and it is accumulating further debt, because this is the only way it's meeting its costs, then those further debts above and beyond an ability to meet its costs are evidence of inevitable default. In truth, we could say that the default existed at the very time that this happens, because of course, if we provided to provide true services to our people, and yet the people can't afford what we're charging for those services, those provisions of infrastructure and whatnot. If the people can't afford that, that is evidence, especially in light of private indebtedness, taxing the people to the extent that they can, to the, near limits of what they can tolerate already. We have a very grave situation extending then from, probably at the latest we could say the early 1980s to now. And of course, this situation has only gotten worse. We've had a president claim to have balanced the budget, but that's never been proven as a fact, and it would be mathematically impossible, in that government costs were not reduced, government revenues were not increased, and therefore, how do you balance the budget? This is yet an ambiguous sentence because it doesn't say what it means by prioritizing government payments. The word prioritizing is put in double quotes. And the deep cuts in other disbursements that it's referring to are neither defined explicitly. But it concludes the sentence saying that this would still cause investors to shun U.S. Treasury securities. Well, of course, the only reason that purported investors would shun federal securities, bonds, is that it's become quite obvious that the federal governments of the world cannot get their houses in order. But why? Well, Geithner himself provides a clue to this in the last sentence of this brief article, which states, he noted that one rating agency has said that failure to pay no debt obligations, whatever that means, would signal severe financial distress and an imminent threat of default. Obviously, an obligation is a debt, so the terminology is a misnomer, probably an intended one. But if they're concerned about this, who are they concerned for, in truth? Who are these investors, which he's mentioned, but not named? As we recall, if we're old enough to do so, as the stock market became distressed in the 80s and later precipitated in one of the greatest stock market crashes in U.S. history in the second term of the Reagan administration, We saw again and again and again that the so-called Federal Reserve, 12 private banks, rescued the purported stock markets by buying tremendous sums of federal securities, bonds. Now, if you were a central bank, which is, of course, the primary purported investor, and in truth, you've accumulated all your wealth by no more than obfuscating the people's promissory obligations into falsified debts to yourself, enriching yourselves without warrant, so much as all the principal ever created and all the interest paid on that principal to you. What's your real concern here? Do you need to maximize your profits beyond that by ensuring somehow that governments can pay what they cannot? When we say this, governments can pay what they cannot, I mean that we're asking the people to pay what the governments have committed to them to pay, which they cannot pay. But how does this happen? Government debt doesn't accumulate the same way because of this implicit obligation, although it does accumulate as an indirect consequence of that, because in being unable to service private debt, we were unable to pay for federal costs. And these tend to accumulate then on the federal side of the ledger, which is evidence, of course, of the terminal condition of the system, which it's been at the brink of terminal failure for a long time. And what's kept us just on this side of it is a perpetual decreasing in interest rates, which makes us only barely able to afford the accumulating sum of falsified indebtedness to the central banking system. And who is reducing those interest rates? Not the federal government, as the Austrian economists tell us, but the Federal Reserve banks, which are not the federal government. They're 12 private corporations, banking corporations, purported banks, purported central banks, who have imposed this obfuscated currency upon us. Well, Geithner is rather revealing, inadvertently I would say, in his further disclosures, which are mentioned in this article. In a letter to senior Republican senators, Geithner said, "Their proposals to keep the debt limit at the current level while ensuring payment of interest on the federal debt is unworkable." What does this mean? Evidently, it's been suggested to keep the debt at the current level by not paying down the principal, but paying the interest. In other words, more or less making it effectively an interest-only loan, which, of course, Geithner is saying is unworkable because it's not paying any of the interest down, which, of course, being as we can't afford even that means that we have to borrow further. So it makes no difference, in truth, whether we pay the principal down or not, because we have so much coming in and we have so much going out, and the difference is going to be the further accumulation of debt, no matter how it all works out that way. Ultimately, the notion of prioritizing payments is futile because the debt limit must be increased regardless of which spending path is adopted, Geithner wrote. There is no credible budget plan under which a debt limit increase can be avoided. What did he just say there? He just confirmed our thesis that this obfuscation of the currency is terminal. He didn't say it was terminal, but he indicated that he has observed himself, and he's calling our Congress to task on account of it. He's observed that a disparity exists, which, in effect, if we interpret what he's just said, means that the obfuscation can only engender terminal failure. Now, he's of course not going to tell us how to resolve that, which would be unthinkable to him, because the only way to solve it is to rectify the obfuscation, to restore the promissory obligations of the people, as we intend to, in adopting mathematically perfected economy, counting all prior payments rightly against principal, all prior payments of interest toward principal, which itself resolves most of the world's public and private debt. Very little debt would even remain. Why? Because we have already paid our debts, which were falsified debts, multiplied falsified debts. We have already paid our debts many times over. Geithner said that because the United States now borrows roughly 40 cents of every dollar it spends, prioritizing payments with no debt limit increase would require cutting 40% of all government expenditures. Imagine that. This would have painful implications for people in every walk of American life, from military families and veterans to Social Security recipients and government employees, he wrote. Continuing interest payments while defaulting on other obligations would not address how the United States would replace maturing Treasury debt, Geithner noted. Would not address how the United States would replace maturing Treasury debt. If we unravel what he's just said there, he's admitting that we have to borrow the principal and interest back in order to sustain ongoing processes which are vital to functioning government and a functioning public, which of course only increases the debt further. He's not noting that, but he has said that it's impossible to lower the debt ceiling, or even to keep it where it is, because debt is going to increase, and because interest is what causes that. Implicitly, he's saying that in these combination of statements here. So in truth, what we have in a very brief article here is we have the Secretary of the Treasury concurring in our thesis of inevitable failure, except that he's persisting in his position at the behest of the banks in order to preserve a system which is inherently and inevitably terminal, without any kind of debate or legitimate discussion of the fundamental cause of this ever-escalating disparity, which imposes inevitably terminal failure upon the world. Well, that's an incredible thing. There's a picture of him here with chair of the Senate Agricultural Committee, Senator Blanche Lincoln, and Senator Saxby Chambliss, Republican of Georgia. You know, they